Welcome to the Beer Taster's Notebook, the show dedicated to learning about beer. I'm Jonathan Thompson, advanced cicerone, beer judge, home brewer, and beer writer. Welcome to the Beer Taster's Notebook, episode 14, Into the Mash. So the mash is where starches in the barley or other grain convert into fermentable sugars that the yeast can then consume and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide, along with all the other byproducts that we love so much. So I'm going to split this up into sections, maybe just a general overview, then some sugars, enzymes, mash types, et cetera, et cetera. So the milled malt is introduced into the mash tun, and there are various types. There are mash filters, et cetera, but the concept is all the same. So the grains get mixed in with hot water called strike water, and this extracts the starches and activates enzymes that will break these starches down into smaller sugars, which are then digestible by the yeast. The water used in brewing, by the way, is called liquor. So there's like a hot liquor tank, which is where the strike water and sparge water and such things would be held and raised to temperature. So also extracted and catalyzed are, lipids, proteins, and some other nutrients. Once this conversion is complete, the liquid, which we call wort, is run off into the brew kettle and boiled. So let's just talk about sugars and saccharides and all things carbohydrate. So carbohydrate is a class of organic compound consisting of a carbon backbone with hydrogen and oxygen atoms attached. That's the simplest way to put it. We don't need to go too nuts with that either. But within this umbrella, we have monosaccharides, which are simple sugars that have 3 to 7 carbons, disaccharides, which are 2 monosaccharides bonded together, and polysaccharides, which are long chains consisting of monosaccharides. So these come in branched and straight chain varieties. Saccharides act as both structural, as in the cell walls of plants, or chitin, which is the shells on the outside of like a lobster or a shrimp or something. And they can also act as storage molecules like starch for plants or glycogen for animals. So we can get into specifics shortly, but the important takeaway when dealing with these compounds from a brewing perspective is that at the end of the day, we need to feed the yeast, and the yeast cannot metabolize certain saccharides, and especially not the big ones. So enzymes cut them up. There's kind of like cutting your food up into bite-sized pieces. Actually, it's more like preparing food, right? Like you're not going to put an entire pineapple on the table, right? You're going to take the stem off and maybe cut it up and take the core out, or maybe you don't, I don't know. But generally people prepare food into something that's a little bit more consumable. And that's sort of the same idea here. So malted barley contains around 3/4 amylopectin and 1/4 amylose. An amylopectin is a branched chain polymer and consists of alpha glucose units, and amylose is a straight chain, or helical really, polysaccharide, and it's also made up of glucose. So the yeast can't really do anything with these, and so enzymes, specifically alpha amylase and beta amylase, need to chop them up into smaller pieces, and we'll get to that part soon. So depending on the mash regime, and modification, et cetera, we'll end up with a finished wort with various levels of various saccharides. So dextrins and limit dextrins are the large polysaccharides. They cannot be metabolized by the yeast, and they kind of add body and sweetness to the beer. Maltodextrins also contribute to the body, and these are the unfermentables, let's call them. Of the fermentables, maltose, which usually makes up 40 to 60% of the wort, is a disaccharide, meaning it contains 2 monosaccharides, of course, and in this case, it's 2 units of glucose. Maltotriose is a trisaccharide consisting of 3 glucose units and is around 15 to 20% of the wort composition. Glucose, being the most digestible of them all, only makes up 10 to 15% of the wort. And sucrose, which is also a disaccharide consisting of a glucose and a fructose unit, it can be split up and metabolized with ease. Fructose can make its way into the party, but it tends to be in smaller amounts, and it's usually just from the cleavage of that sucrose. Okay, so I think that we're pretty good on the sugars, but the main takeaway is that yeast generally cannot metabolize saccharides containing 4 or more glucose units, and so anything bigger than 3 really needs to be chopped up. Anything that cannot be chopped up remains in the beer and contributes to a bigger body and to more sweetness. Okay, so now let's talk enzymes. So this is one of my favorite things, and I'm going to work very hard to exercise monastic-like restraint here. So an enzyme, with almost no exception, is a protein, and it is folded in a very specific way. So these catalyze specific reactions and are very central to biochemistry. What is pretty cool is that the enzymes don't get consumed by the reaction. So many of these reactions would take place on their own, but they would be slow. And so enzymes facilitate speed and efficiency here. So most enzymes perform a single function, and a lot of them are reversible as well. And also the naming conventions are extremely convenient. So most people have heard of lactase as the enzyme that people consume when they have a lactose tolerance issue. This is an enzyme that does one thing. It splits apart lactose. Beta-glucanase breaks apart beta-glucans. And so you can see sort of where I'm going with this. There are some that have some strange names and they're not really that descriptive, but for the most part, it's pretty decent. So enzyme names also end in A's for the most part, and this makes life pretty easy breezy, right? So without getting too complex, the enzyme has an active site and an allosteric site. So a common way that enzymes are described as is kind of like a lock and key. The key being the substrate, and it fits into the lock, which is the enzyme. So like maltose doesn't fit into lactase and lactose doesn't fit into maltase, etc. So this is a pretty good visual. But another way that I like to sort of describe it is kind of like a two-sided Pac-Man with funny shaped mouths. This might seem kind of stupid at first. Maybe it's stupid, period. I'm not sure, but just stick with it for a second. So like Pac-Man is a circle, and on the right side, let's say, is the active site mouth, and it's shaped like the substrate. And on the left is the allosteric site mouth, and it's shaped like the end product. So basically, the allosteric site is the inhibitor trigger. And so when there's too much, or I guess the right amount of the product, the excess binds to the allosteric site and the enzyme goes on break. When the level drops, the product is released and the break is over and enzymes go back to work. So enzymes, of course, are not shaped like Pac-Man, but it doesn't really matter for this purpose. Hopefully that sort of explains partially how they work. So another couple of things to know about enzymes are things called coenzymes and cofactors. And so how can I describe these? They're kind of like power adapters for other countries. So if the substrate is a square and the active site is a semicircle and the coenzyme is a semicircle with a square opening, does that make any sense? Then the cofactor would fit into the enzyme and then the substrate fits into the cofactor. I think that makes sense. So certain cofactors would be like zinc, which is a cofactor in alcohol dehydrogenase, or another coenzyme like acetyl-CoA is a coenzyme in a ton of reactions. And so, like I said, it fits into the active site and allows the substrate to lock in. It's kind of like an adapter. Okay. So, as we said, enzymes are not Pac-Man. They are proteins folded into complex shapes. They become active at certain pH ranges and temperatures and inactive at others. And then they're sensitive enough to be completely denatured, like they unravel and they're toast. Renaturing does not exist. So if they end up getting, it's usually heat sensitivity. I mean, pH sensitivity is a thing too, but it's usually heat on the upper end. So, for example, if you heat alpha amylase to 70 degrees Celsius, which is, I guess, 158 Fahrenheit, denaturing will begin. And at 85 degrees Celsius, the party's over and RIP alpha amylase. Okay, so the key enzymes in the malt are beta amylase, alpha amylase, proteases, beta glucanases, and limit dextrinase. Okay, now moving into the mash tun here. So the volume of water is going to matter. Or maybe we should call it the thickness of the mash. So the mash is kind of like a porridge, right? It's a bunch of crushed grains mixed with hot water. A thin mash, so the more water is going to improve efficiency. But if the mash is too thin, then sparging is going to become an issue because the final volume is going to be too high, right? The extraction will be compromised, and then you're just going to end up with like really thin wort, or you're just not going to have extracted enough because you can't use any more water because you're going to be over volume. A thick mash can cause issues, but it does protect beta amylase at higher temperatures. So it allows them to be sort of less sensitive to the higher temperatures as far as denaturing goes, just by jamming them packed full of other things. But it can cause the mash to get really stuck, and then it can exaggerate drainage issues. So a compromise obviously needs to be made. Now, also a thicker mash can sometimes be necessary if you're using a high gravity beer, or if you're brewing a high gravity beer, because you'd need a bigger grain bill, right? So this could test the capacity of the mash tun, and you don't want it overflowing. So you're going to have to use less liquid, and then you have to sort of dilute things as we go along. But I guess the final point here on thickness is really that too thick a mash can inhibit enzyme activity. And there are several reasons for this. First off, the more crowded the space is, the more difficult it is for the enzymes to find unconverted starches to work on. I don't really buy this as a primary reason, but what makes it more sense to me, and maybe this is just me, but it's the water is going to gelatinize the starch, right? And this sort of bursts the starch molecules, allowing the enzymes to get to work. Less water means less hydration, and therefore, right? Secondly, we discussed the allosteric sites on the enzymes earlier, and if you had a higher concentration of product, there would likely be more of a chance of binding to these sites and inhibiting the enzyme. So it's probably a combination of all those things. Okay, so what goes on in the mash? So the simplest mash regime is called infusion mash. Pretty popular amongst British brewers. The brewer dumps the malt into the mash tun and adds hot water. Temperature is maintained, and that is it. This works very well with well-modified malt, but not so well with under-modified malt. So some other mash regimes here are the step mash, the decoction mash, the turbid mash. So step mashing involves a series of stands at specific temperatures. The goal here is to optimize enzymatic activity at various stages, and I'll explain that shortly. Decoction mash involves pulling a portion of the liquid out, boiling it, and then reintroducing it. Turbid mashing, which is pretty much reserved now for lambic beers, but basically it starts at a low temperature and hot water is gradually added like with decoction, but portions are pulled off boil, but then they're not immediately reintroduced. And we'll get to these in detail quite shortly. Okay, so a mash tun is a vessel in which the malt is mashed. That should be, I guess, pretty obvious. But in a homebrew situation, like a cooler with a valve and either a false bottom, which is a perforated plate, or a screen attached to the valve is employed. And so in a commercial setting, it's a temperature-controlled tank with sort of similar features for drainage. And a lauter tun is a separate vessel designed for filtering out the wort. Sometimes these are both used. Sometimes a mash tun is a combination sort of mash tun, lauter tun. Generally, a two-piece system results in better extraction. But sometimes, obviously, smaller breweries are not going to have room for two vessels. And in a home brew setting, what's the point, right? And so another system to be aware of is called a mash filter. Basically, it's a series of plates with screens, basically filters in them, as the name would imply. And so instead of using gravity, it actually uses mechanical pressure, right? So the wort in basically the mash is forced through these membranes and extracting the wort. It's highly efficient. Obviously, it's a big, expensive system, and so it's used on a larger level than on the smaller brewery side, and definitely not in home brewing. Okay, so let's start with infusion mashing. So the grain goes in, hot water is then added, and then the temperature is held. This temperature is typically between 63.3 and 68.8 Celsius, to be exact. Actually, that's ridiculous. It's 63 to 68. Let's just leave it there. So that's around 146 to 156 if we want to use the F word, which I generally don't. So my apologies to anyone who has to continue to convert, but that's just the way it goes. Metric rules, man. Okay, so this method only works on well-modified malt, which is most malt nowadays anyways, except for some specialty malts and some continental malts. But the key here is that beta amylase is active from 55 degrees to 66 degrees centigrade, and alpha amylase from 65 to 72. So staying here kind of guarantees activity for both, one being more dominant depending on which end of the temperature range we're at. So, that's just the balance that we need to achieve here. So this takes about an hour, and those enzymes chop up the polysaccharides, mainly amylopectin and amylose, into maltose, maltotriose, and glucose. At the end of the mash, a mash out is conducted whereby hotter water is introduced. This denatures the enzymes and locks in the fermentability. Now, step mashing involves starting at a lower temperature, like 40 to 55 Celsius. We call that a protein rest or an acid rest. This lasts 15 to 20 minutes typically. And so in this phase, the protease enzymes break down larger proteins into smaller peptides and amino acids. Pepsidases then break down the peptides into smaller amino acids. Incidentally, beta-glucanase is active at these temperatures and breaks down, you guessed it, beta-glucans. And beta-glucans can be kind of gummy. And so beta-glucanase activity can reduce the viscosity of the wort. Beta-glucans have high water binding property, and this is what makes them get a bit gummy. And so this is good when using unmalted grain, but it can lead to a thinner body if it's allowed to go on too long. Oats are high in beta-glucans. I'm sure you can picture the gummy texture of oatmeal, especially if you leave it around for a while. And so the oats in oatmeal stouts and some IPAs, etc., oats in any real beer really, will increase the body via the improved beta-glucan contribution there. And so the protein rest, it's not commonly used with well-modified malts, but in the case of high adjuncts or under-modified malts, it might be quite necessary. So the ferulic acid rest, which is the same temperature range and time, so really it's all the same rest, is designed to maximize the release of bound ferulic acid. Ferulic acid is the precursor via ferulic acid decarboxylase or phenylacrylic decarboxylase into 4-vinyl guaiacol or 4-VG, and that is the clove aroma, which is very key to Bavarian Weiss beer. So the precursor needs to be there for that beer, but the yeast also matters. So in a case where you have a accidental acid rest, but you don't have something that's going to convert it, you won't get that clove. And the next common step is the beta amylase rest. This is the 60 to 64 range. And then this is where the beta amylase is the most active, breaking larger starches into smaller and more fermentable sugars, as we mentioned. And then alpha amylase comes in at the higher temperature of 65 to 71, and that will break some of those remaining starches into long chain sugars, which will contribute body and sweetness. Then the mash out is when water, as we mentioned, 75 to 77 degrees Celsius is introduced and stops all activity. The enzymes become inhibited or denatured, and now we have our fermentables locked in. So it's probably a good idea just to define the difference between alpha and beta amylase. So they both chop up larger saccharides into smaller pieces, but the way that they operate is slightly different. So beta amylase probably produces the most fermentables, and what it does is it chops off maltose molecules from the non-reducing end of the chain. So it kind of like it starts snipping them off. Whereas with alpha amylase, it kind of randomly chops up from like the alpha 1 and 4. And so you end up with longer glucose chains, and it can create some dextrins as well as maltose. And so I mean, you do want both, but you're going to get more dextrins with the alpha amylase. Okay, so moving to the decoction mash. This is the traditional method in continental Europe, actually Germany and Czechia. And so the purpose is to gelatinize the starches and then produce deeper flavors via Maillard. And so it was pretty essential originally, just due to the under-modification of malts. And basically what you do is you start with a pretty thick mash, and then a portion gets drawn off and boiled, and then this portion gets returned to the mash. And then as a result, this pushes the temperature up to the next rest. So it's kind of like step mashing, except that you're pulling wort out and boiling it, which actually changes the composition of that wort. It would also denature whatever's in the wort, right? So you're locking in fermentables at each stage. And there are different methods. There's a single decoction, there's double decoction and triple decoction, which is what it sounds like. It's drawing them off and having different sort of temperatures. Triple decoction is the traditional method, and it produces the most complex flavors. Decoction mashing is still popular in Czechia and Germany, as mentioned. And actually in Czechia, there's a PGI, which is kind of like an AOC or DOC. And only with decoction mashing can one obtain that credential. Pilsner Urquell is a decoction mash, for example. And so the boil times will vary per beer. The longer the boil, the darker, right? And so I guess it depends on what you're making. So Pilsner Urquell is not going to have super long boil times, but something like an Urbock or a Dunkelbock is definitely going to have longer boils because you want the darker end results. Okay, so moving to turbid mashing. So the origins here are kind of interesting. So in the early 1800s, Belgium taxed brewers on the size of their mash tun, like the actual size of the vessel. And so you'll notice that brewing practices, by the way, seem to be invariably shaped and determined by crazy tax schemes. And so they start with a very thick mash. A portion is removed and boiled, but unlike decoction, it stays out, at least for now. And so the boiling will denature the enzymes, but they're not really looking for too much in the way of Maillard. The temperature continues to be raised and more liquid continues to be drawn off and boiled. Then comes a mash out and then lautering, and then the removed liquid goes back in. And so they also use a lot more sparge water, by the way, because the grain to liquid ratio is super high. So what happens here is you get this really cloudy wort that has a significant portion of unconverted starches and dextrins. And so this, of course, sounds kind of bad, but the process is primarily used now for lambic beer styles, where these saccharides feed the wild yeasts and other microbes, right? So the sort of quote-unquote normal yeast can't really eat this stuff, and so it leaves food for the other guys, and then we get all those wild and funky byproducts that make the beer so exciting. So basically, we're roping off a section of the buffet for the secondary guests. And so that's turbid mashing. So with mashing in general, time matters. It usually takes 60 to 90 minutes. Too short, and we risk under-converting and ending up with a sweet, thick beer. And too long, and we end up converting too much and end up with a thin and dry beer. In both cases, this might be the intended outcome, but the takeaway is that finding the ideal time based on inputs and other variables should result in the intended conversion and gravity. Okay, now let's talk pH. So the ideal range is 5.2 to 5.6. This is where the enzymes in question work best, but it also helps out down the road. So hop extraction is maximized, protein breaks improve, chill haze is reduced, the yeast health is better as a result of an improved extraction of certain minerals like calcium, magnesium, zinc, manganese, etc. The extraction of certain phenolic compounds is reduced as well. So recall that higher polyphenol extraction can cause haze issues as well as elevated astringency. So reducing these is obviously paramount. Managing the pH levels, to say the least, is quite crucial. And I think we mentioned acidulated malt in the malt episode, or sour malts as it's also called. But this is malt that has been inoculated with lactobacillus and therefore can lower the pH without violating the Reinheitsgebot. For those of us not subject to such restrictions, other non-malt options exist. So lactic or phosphoric acid can be added directly in. There are pH buffers that are labeled and sold as such, and those can be employed as well. The main contributor to pH issues in the past, of course, was the water. And this was a really big deal back in the day because we had no idea about water chemistry. And then part of the reason that certain places made certain beers. So Pilsen has nice soft water and can make a sparkling golden concoction that was quite delicious and changed the face of beer. Dublin water is pretty alkaline, which means that they had to use the higher acidity of darker malts to balance this out. And then I think we all kind of know where that led. So the mash pH is, as I mentioned, super important, but of course now it is controllable via water chemistry. And so we can brew dark beers, light beers, whatever beers we want, wherever we want. Okay, so we're coming to the end of the mash. So mash out occurs when hot water is added to denature these enzymes and halt conversion. Not always, but pretty often the wort's drained and recirculated. It's called a Vorlauf. And so in my setup at home, I pop a quick connect hose onto the drain valve of my mash tun, which feeds into a pump whose output feeds back into the mash tun. So basically, I just recirculate the wort through the grain bed. And this is the same process done everywhere. I'm just sort of giving you a more visual description of how I do it. And so this allows the grain bed to settle, and then it starts to strain out any particulate. So you're watching this stuff to see how sort of clear it's getting and whether you've got bits of stuff in there, because they should start to get filtered out by the barley husks. And so once desired clarity is reached, the wort's then going to be drained into the boil kettle. And after the first runoff, sparging is going to begin. And that's when hot water is sort of sprinkled over the grain bed until the target volume or target gravity in the boil kettle is reached. And so that's pretty much it. But let's just remember the variables affecting the mash are time, temperature, pH, malt modification, grain bill, of course, and mash thickness. So I think that's it for mash. Next is the boil. Until then, stay thirsty and stay curious.